Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of contemporary British political interest.
This is our midweek episode. If you're looking for something a bit more substantive, then you can listen to our long discussion about how Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party. That came out on Sunday, and that's available wherever you get your podcasts. But in these midweek Matters of Interest podcasts, Richard and I each pick a topic that has piqued our interest in the past week and then discuss it in a little bit of detail. So, Richard, why don't you get us started this episode?
Well, my matter of interest this week comes from a blog post written by a gentleman called Jason Locke, who is a historian of the British Constitution. He's actually based in America at Madison, Wisconsin. His blog is called A Venerable Puzzle, which is a reference to Queen Elizabeth II's description of the British Constitution as puzzling, and it will always be puzzling, she said. And she said that to my Queen Mary colleague, Peter Hennessy. So this is a post he wrote called Administrative Oblivion, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and the Role of the Peerage. And it raises, I think, some really fascinating and under-discussed fallout from the decision to strip the artist previously known as Prince Andrew from his noble titles, including the Dukedom of York. Listeners may or may not be aware that when Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, as he is now, was made Duke of York, he was also made a member of the House of Lords, and this happened in 1986. And there's video of him being introduced into the House of Lords, because at that time you hadn't yet had the Tony Blair reforms, which had removed most of the hereditary peers, or the Keir Starmer reforms that have removed all of the hereditary peers. So if you were given a title of nobility, you were entitled to sit in the House of Lords. This becomes relevant later on, but let me just talk through some of the events that occurred. So obviously the people will be familiar with the associations of Andrew with Jeffrey Epstein and the hostile reaction to their friendship and association and the allegations against Andrew. And so it was decided that he would lose his titles of nobility. Now, the issue is that the constitutional precedent in Britain for that is if someone is to be stripped of their peerage, to lose their title of nobility, then the way that has often been understood to do that is through legislation. That's through an act of parliament. And we saw this very visibly in 1917, in the Titles Deprivation Act 1917, where those peers who had been seen as sympathizers or collaborators of the Central Powers, Germany and so on, during the First World War, lost their noble titles. And the language of the legislation basically said that there will be a committee that will draw up a list of names of people who should lose their titles, and then the king is empowered to strip them of their titles on the basis of this statute law. And so from a sort of straightforward legal perspective, the most legally uncontentious way of removing Andrew's dukedom and other titles — he was also an earl and a baron — was to pass a bill, an act of parliament that would remove those. But it's very politically contentious to do that, not least that it would be seen to have taken up parliamentary time, that the Starmer government would have its hands on it, as having to steer this bill through Parliament. And so the government looked for another way that Andrew could lose his titles. And so they looked to the powers of the royal prerogative, the powers that the king is understood still to have, that are either reserved to the monarch or that the prime minister can advise the king to do. And they basically got it done through that manner. But as Jason Locke writes in his blog post, this is somewhat murky, because if you look at the royal warrant that was used to strip Andrew of his titles, it doesn't actually deprive him of the underlying peerages. It says that he will be stricken from the role of the peerage. And this goes back to a royal warrant from Queen Elizabeth II in 2004, where she says, any peer who has not entered on the roll shall not be entitled to any precedence attaching to his peerage, or be addressed or referred to by any title attaching to his peerage. And that is basically what happened with Andrew. Now, Jason raises the interesting question, or my interpretation of Jason's piece. He doesn't talk about this in great detail in the piece, but my reading from this is, well, what would happen now then if a prime minister advised the king to strip someone else of their peerage, not someone who sits outside of the House of Lords, but someone who is a sitting member of the House of Lords? If someone currently is a baron, a life peer, and the royal prerogative is used to strip them of their membership of the role of peerage, does that take them out of the House of Lords? And if it does this give prime ministers, has this set a precedent for prime ministers to advise the king to kick people out of the House of Lords? I don't think this is something that has been seriously discussed, but I think it becomes relevant if you think, for example, if you had a reform government where Nigel Farage was having difficulty getting his legislation through the House of Lords. Could Nigel Farage advise the king to remove from the role of peerage 200 Labour peers who are the most tricky and difficult for a reform government?
It's a very interesting topic, and some thoughts immediately spring to mind. One of them is that it brings forward a question about the nature of the royal prerogative and how it is exercised, and the extent to which the prerogative depends upon advice from the Prime Minister, advice sometimes referred to as advice with the capital A, that the monarch is bound to accept and to act upon, or whether or not there is discretion on the part of the palace and on the part of the monarch in terms of how they exercise the royal prerogative. This is a debate that's gone on for quite a number of years around things like prorogation, of course, fairly recently, but also around whether or not the monarch is entitled to disallow a request or ignore a request for Parliament to be dissolved. So they're sometimes referred to as the Lascelles principles. And that came up when Boris Johnson was in the very final days of his premiership, about what would happen if Johnson went to the Queen, as was, and said, I would like a dissolution of Parliament. I want to fight a general election rather than be removed by my own party. Would the Queen be entitled to say no to that? So that's always been a bit of an ongoing debate, which I think this generates. More specifically on the question of Andrew, it begs a couple of questions. One is that point about to what extent has he really ceased to be a peer legally? To what extent has he been stripped of his dignity and nobility on the basis of what has happened? In a practical sense, I guess it doesn't much matter in the sense that even if it's a bit of a legal fiction that he has been stripped of all of the status that he had as Duke of York and as a prince, then if everybody acts as if that is the case, then even if the legal reality is slightly murkier, then it is in fact, for all intents and purposes, the case. It does also bring to mind the thought of why did the government not choose to go for legislation, if that would be the more conventional and standard thing to do. Now, we don't know what discussions perhaps went on about what would be the best way of doing this. I do feel, though, that maybe if they had thought through some of the consequences that you have suggested in the future about whether or not this does seem to create, to the extent that a royal prerogative can be created, a new right for prime ministers to advise the monarch to strip somebody of their peerage, whether or not they would have thought, well, actually, the cleaner thing to do here is to have a very simple bill, which would have been nodded through, in effect, both houses of Parliament. I do not know of any MP or any peer who would have stood up to really oppose this. Certainly vast majorities in both houses would have been content to push through a piece of legislation. So it's interesting as to why they didn't choose to go for legislation. I don't really think it would have taken up very much parliamentary time at all. Certainly a great many things that need not take up parliamentary time do. You know, Parliament sometimes wastes vast amount of the relatively limited time that it has. The final thing I wanted to throw out there as a sort of a thought or a question is about the ability of prime ministers to basically manipulate the composition of the House of Lords. Now, of course, this is a very long-standing thing that prime ministers have the right to do. But currently, the extent to which a prime minister can do that depends upon appointments. This is often discussed in terms of the Parliament Act at the beginning of the 20th century and in the debates around the People's Budget, when we were really in a different constitutional framework in terms of the conventions and the relationship between the Commons and the Lords than we are now. But of course, it also comes up for debate and discussion quite often in terms of the New Year's Honours List, which we will have soon, which will probably create new peers, and also when prime ministers basically create peers either for their own party or in cooperation with the other parties for them as well. So what seems to be potentially happening here, or what has opened up at least in terms of the debate, is that the ways in which a prime minister could distort or manipulate the composition of the Lords may have expanded, not just from appointments, which is long-standing and generally operates within a framework of at least mild restraint on the part of prime ministers in terms of the conventions that govern it, to something which could be a bit of a no man's land in terms of precedent and the challenges that Parliament could face if a prime minister could use the prerogative to remove peers.
Well, a few points in response, Lee. So the first is on this question about the discretion of the monarch to refuse the advice of the prime minister. I think we have a little bit of a difference of view on that. In my view, if the government of the day sincerely wants something to happen and they advise the monarch to use the prerogative to make that happen, then I think the king or the queen is duty bound to follow them. I don't think the monarch has discretion on that. Now, I know that there are some people who disagree. You are one of them. I know that the situation is somewhat different, let's say, in the Commonwealth realms, where curiously it's often the vice-regal representatives, the governors general and the governors, say, of the Australian states, for example, who are all crown representatives, and in some sense should legally operate in the same way that the crown operates in Britain vis-a-vis the elected governments of the Commonwealth realms. And yet we have seen some examples in more recent times of vice-regal representatives actually exercising a degree of discretion that the monarch of the day would not exercise. In fact, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but it is our podcast, so what the hell? This was, I think, part of the constitutional misunderstanding behind the American Declaration of Independence, because even in the 18th century, by the end of the 18th century, the British monarch had effectively lost the power to veto parliamentary legislation within Britain. And the last royal veto, the last time that a monarch withheld royal assent for an act of the British Parliament, was Queen Anne in the early 18th century, the Scottish Militia Bill, which itself was actually on the advice of her government. So, and this is a complicated story there. So actually, really, the last time that a monarch properly withheld royal assent was under the reign of William III in the 17th century. So by the time, 100 years later almost, you get to George III, he can't withhold his assent from acts of parliament. If you read the Declaration of Independence, the American rebels are grumpy that the king has not blocked these intolerable acts of taxation and so on against the American colonies. But part of their misunderstanding, some of it genuine, some of it political, is that the colonial governors who represented the king for the colonial legislatures that existed in America, and people forget in America that actually Americans had some of the most democratic representation in the world in the late 18th century, because they elected their own legislatures under the crown. The colonial governors were much more willing to use their veto. So there is a difference there. But I think in Britain, it has been now long established, and I think the Lascelles principles are a bit of a red herring, to be honest. I think it's been long established that the monarch should follow the advice of the government of the day. Now, it's not to say that the monarch, through back channels, before that request is made, could indicate that the monarch would be rather unhappy about doing this. And that is what happened 100 years ago in the questions about the Liberals appointing hundreds of new Liberal peers to push through the people's budget. And basically the king made it known that he would eventually assent to this if he felt the government of the day could get a democratic mandate for doing it, even though the king himself wasn't a great fan of doing it. So that's okay to have that bit of negotiation. But if the government really presses it, I think the elected government, has to prevail. The second point that you raised is the question as to why the Labour government didn't go via legislation. And, it is a shortcut, basically, what they did here. And you say, I think fairly, that such a bill, the Titles Deprivation Act 2025, would sail through the Commons and Lords very quickly without many votes against it. There'd be no chance that it would be defeated. However, it would be open to some degree of debate. And I suspect that the government would be somewhat nervous that this could open a can of worms, with the Epstein issue, and that this might invite, for example, Conservative MPs to talk about Lord Mandelson's connections with Epstein. Should Lord Mandelson lose his peerage? I haven't really heard people talk about that, but it might open up that can of worms. The other thing is it might invite some Labour MPs who are hostile to monarchy, Republicans in the British sense, a small r sense, to use it as an opportunity to talk about the abolition of the monarchy, which may not fit with the patriotic image that this current Labour government sometimes, depending on its mood, wishes to project. So I think those are reasons why it probably wanted to steer clear of parliamentary debate. It's somewhat cowardly to do that, and I think it will cause them some problems for doing that. The third issue you raise is about the importance of restraint in the British Constitution. My Queen Mary colleague Peter Hennessy is very famous for this idea of the good chaps theory of the British Constitution, that the British Constitution requires a degree of restraint and good behavior from those who have the power to do things, but need to think about exercising some discretion in using that power, and not just using raw power for the sake of short-term advancement, but thinking about themselves as, what do we hand on to future generations? What do we open up to our opponents that maybe we don't want to open up, so we hold back a bit? I would say this is actually true in all constitutions. I think it's a little bit spurious, but it's often used to have a pot shot of the British Constitution and to kind of make out the British Constitution is uniquely vulnerable to bad actors. I think all constitutional systems are ultimately open to bad actors. The US Constitution, some might argue, has already been used in various nefarious ways. If you've got judges who interpret the Constitution for political or ideological reasons, then they're not acting like good chaps and chapesses on the Supreme Court either. And you have no recourse really to remove them in the US system, in a way that in Britain, at least ultimately, it always comes back to the electorate. But just to add maybe an additional point here, and I think I would be duty-bound to say this, is that the author of this blog post, Jason Locke, who inspired this matter of interest, I think doesn't necessarily take quite the same view that I have. I think it's just worth pointing out. I think he takes the view that it might have opened up this argument about the monarch having the royal prerogative to remove peerages, but I think he ultimately takes the view that it is still the established constitutional understanding that you need legislation to remove someone's peerage fully and therefore to deprive them of their seat in the House of Lords.
To finish on this topic, I just wanted to come back to the point you made about restraint. Well, I think the point I first made about restraint and why parties show it and why prime ministers demonstrate it in office quite often on these questions. It's partly because the top of British politics has, well, ever since the collapse of the Liberal Party and their replacement by the Labour Party, basically been a rotation between two political parties. And the one thing that the Labour Party could always be fairly confident of, and the Conservative Party the same, is that if they are in opposition, they will at some stage return to government, or if they are in government, they will at some stage be replaced by the other. The extraordinary volatility we see in our politics at the moment, combined with the new multi-party politics that we see at the moment, where Reform UK is leading in pretty much all the polls, and lots of MRP projections of what would happen if an election was held at the moment show that they would win the most seats. Some have even suggested Reform would get a majority. Is the duopoly of parties appears to be broken at the moment. And there is an outsiders party, ironically made up of somebody who's been very much in British political life for a long time and is now occupied by a lot of people who were in the Conservative Party once upon a time, but nevertheless they are cast as outsiders to the political establishment who do not have an interest in restraint around the exercise of the Constitution. They feel in part, Reform UK make this point at the moment around the appointment of peers, they feel that the Constitution has been wielded against them, in spite of the fact that they polled fairly well at the last general election and poll very well at the moment. So if they do get in, the extent to which they will feel that they ought to exercise restraint will, I think, be significantly reduced. And that is, in fact, one of the threats that certainly I, as a constitutional conservative, feel about the risk of a Reform UK government, is that I do not think Prime Minister Farage would feel restrained by the conventions that surround our constitution if he felt that it was necessary to exercise his partisan power.
And that's why I think it's important, actually, for this current Labour government to not play too much constitutional hardball when it comes to, say, the exclusion of reform from existing conventions. At the moment, for example, there are no reform peers in the House of Lords. No, I don't think that the election of MPs to the House of Lords necessarily confers an automatic entitlement for peers in the upper chamber, but generally speaking, it has been the case that if a party is elected to the lower chamber, that eventually, if that party is interested in appointing peers to the upper chamber, they do get their peers. The example I can think of is the Greens. When Caroline Lucas was first elected as a Green MP in 2010, eventually in that parliament, David Cameron appointed a Green-nominated peer, Baroness Jones, Jenny Jones, to become the first Green member of the House of Lords. I think it took maybe 3 years. So I think some of the reform disquiet about Starmer not yet appointing reform peers may be a bit premature, but I think eventually, by the end of this parliament, it would be constitutionally proper for Keir Starmer to advise the king to appoint probably more than one reform-nominated member of the House of Lords. If Starmer does not do that, then I think that gives more sense of grievance against the system, that it will open up a more aggressive and hostile and ultimately more constitutionally revolutionary approach by Reform UK should they form a government or part of a government.
I would agree. It seems very difficult to justify really not allowing Reform UK to have any representation in the House of Lords, given that they do have 5 seats in the House of Commons and they do poll very well. And obviously the Lords is not there to be a representative chamber in the sense that it ought not, prime ministers and governments ought not feel bound to try and make the House of Lords look like the latest opinion poll or look like the result of the last general election to the House of Commons. That would be a pointless and, in some respects, self-defeating and absurd thing to do. But still, if there is a large body of political opinion in the country that is not represented in the Lords, and I think there is an obligation to certainly try and accommodate it in some respects.
And speaking of minor parties, Lee, what is your matter of interest this week?
Well, this week I wanted to talk about a topic that we're occasionally accused of neglecting on this podcast, which is Britain's traditional and now reasserted third party, the Liberal Democrats. I think there's a bit of a riddle going on with the Lib Dems, if I'm honest. And I want to just talk about that a little bit and would very much welcome, of course, Richard's views, but also the views of listeners. In one sense, of course, the Lib Dems are a party that is deeply and keenly trying to pitch itself as a progressive party. But they are a quote-unquote progressive party that is now overwhelmingly representing former safe conservative seats where more than half of people for a very, very long time opted to vote Conservative. Now, how they've managed to bring that about is by having an extraordinarily efficient distribution of votes at the last general election. So the Lib Dems got about 12% of the vote in that election and managed to turn that into 72 constituencies. And of course, these are seats that they want to win again at the next general election. But doing that in some respects, I think, is going to be potentially quite difficult, or there's certainly some challenges that they will have to navigate in doing so. First of all, it is worth pointing out the downside of having an incredibly efficient distribution of votes in constituencies, and that is that you tend to win seats by quite small margins. So if we take the constituency that you and I live in, Richard, here in the Witney constituency, when the Lib Dems won that in 2024, they did so with both the lowest vote share and the smallest majority in the constituency's history. Now, I'm not trying to take it away from them. A win is a win. But in a time of volatile politics, that is a pretty flimsy basis on which to have won a constituency. Where do the Lib Dems then go from here? How do they try and retain those seats, or how do they try and expand their footprint? I think they've only really got one option based on what I'm seeing at the moment of what it is that they can do. And that is to try and retain their status as basically being a tactical vote against another party in some parts of the country. So leading into 2024, they very much pitched themselves as being a tactical vote against the Conservative Party in lots of these seats. And now when you hear Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, speak, and when you hear some of their MPs speak, they're trying to pitch themselves on the basis of local government by-elections, for example, as being the anti-reform party, and to try and consolidate themselves in the seats that they have as being the people who can prevent reform winning them. One of the things that I came across and saw quite recently is polling that asked supporters of the different parties who were they most keen to vote against in a general election. And the thing that was really interesting now, and this I think sits behind part of the Lib Dem strategy at the moment, is that the party that Lib Dem voters were most keen to stop winning were Reform UK. So 56% of Lib Dem supporters identified Reform as the party they most wanted to stop. Curiously, only 12% of them said that the Conservative Party was the party they most wanted to stop. So there is arguably an opportunity there for the Conservative Party, having been somewhat rehabilitated by the emergence of Reform with some Lib Dem supporters, as being an opportunity for the Conservatives to recover. Interestingly, the numbers for people hoping to stop Reform or being most keen to stop Reform among Green voters and Labour voters were quite similar, at 62% and 52% respectively. And just to square the circle really on what that polling showed, among Conservative supporters, 59% of people said they were most keen to vote to stop the Labour Party. 18% of Conservative supporters, interestingly, said they would vote to stop Reform UK. And among Reform UK, a whopping 80% of people said that they would principally vote against, if that was the way in which the election was framed, the Labour Party, with only 5% of people saying that they would vote against the Conservatives, 4% against the Greens, and just 2% against the Lib Dems. So what you begin to see, I think, in this polling at the moment, and it's going to be a topic for the Lib Dems to try and navigate, I think, in terms of how they pitch themselves as a anti-reform UK tactical vote, if that is indeed what they're to continue to do, of people, about half of the supporters of Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens, all being chiefly motivated, if they're to vote negatively, to vote against Reform UK.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I don't tend to see the Lib Dems as a left of centre political party. I would view them as a fundamentally right of centre party, if anything. And therefore, for me, it's no surprise that Lib Dem MPs represent areas that have historically voted Conservative, because I think that they are fundamentally aligned with various right-wing values. I think that the liberalism that the Liberal Democrats believe in is fundamentally different to socialism, which for me is what defines left-wing politics. And I think part of the problem is that the way in which people have come to talk about politics in the contemporary age is that people think in terms of what we might call social issues and people's views on various social matters like race or LGBT issues or maybe the environment and things like that. And people see these in left-right terms. For me, fundamentally, left-right politics is defined about one's views about the economy and about the role of the state in the economy. And therefore, I would say that when it comes to those fundamental left-right questions, the Lib Dems sit, to me, more on the right of the ledger than on the left. To the extent that the Lib Dems believe in a redistributive state or an active state, it tends to be, I think, much more in what we might kind of call an ameliorative form of politics, which is effectively seeing the state as literally a safety net to catch the people who would otherwise fall between the cracks. It's almost a kind of a charitable mindset about the state. My friend Richard Tuck has referred to this mindset as seeing the British state as the armed wing of Oxfam. And I think that defines something of the Liberal Democrats' mentality. For me, as someone who would view myself as a socialist, I would say the key elements of that are a belief in a strong, active and redistributive state, one in which many of the means to use the old clause 4 of the Labour Party, of production, distribution and exchange are in public hands, where the state provides a wide range of public services for low or no cost, where the advantages of private wealth for a few are minimized by the widely distributed benefits of public wealth for the many. And that's actually in the current clause 4 of the Labour Party, that language about for the many and not the few, and where public goods and public services are managed on the basis of common benefit and not on the basis of profit. And there may be things in that Lib Dems think, oh, that sounds kind of nice. But I think there are also lots of things in that Lib Dems are instinctively against. And they view the state as perhaps a necessary evil in some manners, or perhaps as a distributor of some kind of certain forms of charitable benefit. But they don't really see the state as a vehicle for refashioning economic relations in society. And so I had to get that off my chest, first of all, Lee, just to say that I just, as a sort of starting premise, I just don't accept the idea that Lib Dems are a left-wing party.
Insofar as the economy goes, I can see the coherence and the credibility of the line you're making. But I think in terms of a lot of the policy issues that come up today and they get debated today, which do have a more social and cultural rather than economic sort of angle to them, even though the economy is sort of ever present in the political agenda and all things tend to have economic dynamics. What you do see, I think, now in lots of issues is that the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party do appear closer together on lots of the policies. Why has that come about? Well, I think in part it's because after 14 years of Conservative-led government, 9 years of Conservative solo government, give or take, I think the Lib Dems and the Labour Party became somewhat bound together in common opposition to Conservative governments in that time. In part because what ended up happening is that the Liberal Democrat parliamentary party changed dramatically and in some ways quite fundamentally. So, of course, Sir Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, has been an MP with a break from 2015 onwards when he lost his seat, but has been an MP for quite a long time. He was a cabinet minister in the coalition government. But because the Lib Dems were reduced to just 8 MPs in 2015, and then because a lot of the seats where they recovered were not necessarily the seats that they had won in the past, some of them were, but there were plenty of seats like here in Oxfordshire that they won for the first time, rather than winning back seats that they had held historically. You end up getting a lot of new people as Lib Dem MPs who I think have a rather different view to the one that was there in the Clegg-led party, which had a lot more orange buck Lib Dem MPs in it, perhaps, who could work fairly easily with the Conservative Party. I don't think that feels as likely to happen now. It's also worth just pointing out that to some degree, we talk, and I think we'll return in the future in the Matters of Interest podcast, to the idea of pacts and arrangements between parties. There was basically a Lib Dem Labour pact at the 2024 general election. The Labour Party basically didn't campaign in a huge number of constituencies where the main opposition to the Conservatives were the Liberal Democrats and vice versa. And the Labour Party really helped the Lib Dems, and the Lib Dems helped the Labour Party get their majority. Now, that was something which, of course, to some degree you can do in a top-down way, but was also reflected in the tactical voting choices that supporters for the two major parties made in their respective constituencies. I do also think it is worth saying, and this is something I felt for quite a long time, that an underpriced outcome at the next general election is an arrangement between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. I think you will not really see the Labour Party go after the Lib Dems because there will be this sense of that being a natural progressive coalition that could emerge in a pact before the next general election and as an actual government, either in coalition or supply and confidence after that next election. So I take your point that in many respects, the Liberal Democrats are not a left-wing party insofar as they are not a socialist party. I mean, by that definition, I think it's pretty easy to say as well that the Labour Party would not be a left-wing party because it is not a socialist party in the sense that there's much to regret about the economic policies, from my view, that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are implementing. But I don't think any of us would call them full-blooded traditional socialism. But if we expand the way in which we think about parties of the left or progressive parties a little bit more to a way that can comfortably capture the present Labour Party and Labour government, then I think it unavoidably also takes in the Liberal Democrats.
I have to respond to a few points there. So the first is on Sir Ed Davey. Of course, we should remember Sir Ed Davey was given a knighthood for his services to a Conservative government in which he served. And how quickly people forget that that 5 of those 14 years of Conservative government were years in which the Liberal Democrats were members of that government and served in ministries and were secretaries of state and all the rest, and signed up to some of the most, in my view, right-wing policies that we've seen since the Thatcher era. Again, thinking of it in terms of economic policy and in terms of the size of the state, which was the Osborne economic agenda and view of slashing and cutting the state. And Osborne has even admitted that he had a number in mind as to what he thought was the biggest that the state should be as a percentage of GDP, and he wanted to get it down to that level. And the Liberal Democrats happily signed up to all of that. The second is on this question about overlap. Look, there's always been some overlap in certain parts between Labour and the Liberal Democrats or Liberals, but there's a fundamental difference, I think, here. And it comes again to these questions of social versus economic policy. On social policy and social issues, kind of post-material or non-material issues, these for the Liberal Democrats are articles of faith. And this kind of liberal or progressive view on these issues is something that they are totally committed to, and it shapes their politics. That's why they're in politics. Then there are some people in the Liberal Democrats and the Liberals before them who had maybe more left-wing economic views and others who had more right-wing economic views. And there was a sense of pluralism, agree to disagree within the Liberal Party and the Liberal Democrats on economic questions. The reverse historically was true in Labour. For Labour, your article of faith, the thing you really cared about, was economic planning, economic management, socialist economics, the role of the state, the welfare state, public ownership, etc. And where you would have flexibility within Labour was a degree of flexibility on social issues. And there was a willingness to agree to disagree on issues. And that's why you did have Labour MPs for most of Labour's history who, for example, had quite religious, socially conservative views on things like abortion, or even when same-sex marriage was brought in, there were Labour MPs who voted against it because that went against their social values. What's happened, unfortunately, very unfortunately from my view, is that Labour has become more flexible on economic questions and has become more dogmatic on social questions. But that speaks to what I see has happened in the Labour Party, much to my regret, which is that Labour has succumbed to the most successful entryist movement in the history of the Labour Party, which is the entryism of Liberals. And that has occurred in my lifetime, where Liberals have gone from being, when I say Liberals, I mean people whose politics is fundamentally driven by their passion over liberal social issues, has gone from being a minority in the party to the kind of dominant class, both in the Labour elected officialdom and also among Labour members. And I think a lot of that actually happened as a result of the Lib Dem coalition. We got a lot of people. I saw it. I witnessed it. I joined the Labour Party before the 2010 election. When I can remember Lib Dem students that I was studying with in Cambridge who shouted and screamed at me for me saying that I thought the Lib Dems were going to go into coalition with David Cameron and the Conservatives. I can remember people telling me I was fear-mongering. How could I say that? The Lib Dems are to the left of Labour. What an outrageous thing to say. And lo and behold, it happened. And what you saw is people like that, those people who were slightly deranged over their reaction to that, then joined the Labour Party in many instances. I literally saw these people who had previously been Lib Dems when I started my studies at Cambridge. By the end of my studies at Cambridge, when I was chair of the Labour Club, they were attending Labour Club meetings and had joined the Labour Party. Those people have been a problem because they ended up changing something about the degree of tolerance, ironically, given liberalism, but actually the Liberal Party and Liberal Democrats are quite intolerant of differences of view on these social issues. And I think that's what's partly poisoned Labour. So I recognise, I know I've been kind of pushing back, but I recognise what you're saying about where Labour is today. In my view, that is the death of the Labour Party, and that may contribute to the death of the Labour Party as a democratic socialist party, which it still officially is, or a social democratic party, or a party of the left, and pushes Labour effectively to a party that is happy with right-wing economics and dogmatic about social liberalism. And in that sense, then it is just another version of the Liberal Democrats. And I could weep, really, if that is the case, because for me, I've often seen the Lib Dems as really my chief opponents in politics. But I think many in Labour today probably can't even understand that. I think that's a great tragedy.
I agree with much of what you said there. My experience of recent years, if you were not told in advance which party a Labour or the Lib Dem activists belong to, and you just had to talk to them and try and figure it out by yourself. The only real giveaway that you would get in recent years is less what they think, but is where they are in the country. So a lot of progressive activists who are involved in politics in rural parts of the southeast or the southwest join the Liberal Democrats, and those same people, if they lived in Sheffield or Liverpool or what to the northwest or maybe parts of Scotland, Scotland's a rather different case, would join the Labour Party. And I actually, some ways, I don't think there's all that much difference. There's some people in the Liberal Democrats, I think, who do often come across as more Cameroon Tories, and they can perhaps be overrepresented in the elected levels of the Liberal Democrats, but maybe less in the activist base. When you were talking about the success of liberalism and its entryism into the Labour Party and how the Labour Party appears to be more and more liberal, it got me thinking about the fact that the Labour Party, as we know, is in a really poor polling position at the moment. And some people do start to talk about existential threats to the Labour Party, whether that's a threat coming from its right in reform or whether that's a threat coming from its left with the Greens, or occasionally people talk about your party or others. But what nobody's really spoken about is whether or not the Lib Dems can actually cannibalise parts of the Labour support and the Labour base. I mean, given what you've said and given what we both seem to believe about where the Lib Dems and Labour have positioned themselves in recent years, it is arguably much less of a jump for people who voted for Keir Starmer's Labour Party last year to go from the Labour Party to the Liberal Democrats than it is for them to go from Labour to Reform or Labour to the Greens. But it seems to be the leaf that we focus on much less. And it also seems to be, from what I can tell at least, the part of the electorate that the Liberal Democrats seem much less keen to try and attract. Now, one of the things that's really striking when you look at Lib Dem campaign strategy, and you see it, for example, on where are the Lib Dems selecting candidates at the moment. Remarkably, they're already selecting candidates for the next general election, which most of us now think will be in 2029, unless there's a major recovery in Labour's polling position. But where they're selecting candidates, with one exception being Sheffield Hallam, Nick Clegg's old constituency, are Conservative-facing seats. So they are still trying to go after it, still trying to further cannibalise the sort of the centre-right and the Cameroon Tories, rather than go after Labour-facing seats, which of course for many years they did hold in seats like Sheffield, but also in places like Manchester and Birmingham and elsewhere. So I do wonder why the Lib Dems seem to be quite boxed in, really, in terms of where they are trying to focus their energies. But it's a topic I'm sure we'll return to in the future, not least in part, I think, because people could sense your antagonism, I think, towards the Lib Dems in the answers that you gave. The Lib Dems, where we are in this part of the country, are my principal opponents in elections. And certainly one thing that I think has historically, but I think less so now with the Labour Party, but historically used to unite Labour and Conservative activists was their mutual frustration, to put it politely, contempt, to be rather less polite and direct, for the Liberal Democrats. In part, I think, even to have a bit of a pop at them, in part because they are a party that loves winning locally. Now, they're diamond-shaped signs, or we say winning here for the Liberal Democrats. But they don't necessarily like the consequences of winning, the responsibility and the burdens that come with power. And you see that very much when Lib Dems get in councils or as members of parliament, and are incredibly effective at deflecting blame for things that happen in areas where they become dominant away to Westminster. And it's an interesting thought, actually, for all of the minor parties, and maybe one that we'll return to in the future, that if you can build up quite an effective base at the local level, that if you can begin to win council seats, even win control of councils, and even, in fact, win MPs, but do not have to serve or give confidence to a government in Westminster, then local issues where you are in direct control tend to be quite low salience for voters. It's really difficult in a local area to get people highly engaged and highly motivated in what is happening at County Hall or the Town Hall. Of course, politics in Westminster, though, is infinitely more salient for the public at large. That is the reason why the Lib Dems were so damaged by going into coalition government between 2010 and 2015, and why they would be in the future. So perhaps what we are, in fact, looking at here is a high point or maybe a sweet spot for the Lib Dems in this period of when they have got a maximally efficient vote spread over certain parts of the country to win them constituencies, when they have a major footprint in local government among policy issues that are not especially salient with voters and shaping voting intentions, but do not have to be responsible for what goes on in Westminster and for how much longer in our multi-party, highly volatile politics they will be able to stay out of decision-making in Parliament is an open question.
Yeah, I would just echo what you said there, Lee, about how I think for those of us who have been political foot soldiers, activists, people who've knocked on doors many years, maybe stood for local political office and have had to face the Liberal Democrats, whether we're Labour or Conservative, we've seen the low skullduggery of the tactics of the Lib Dems, which is quite characteristic of Lib Dems, I think, across the country. I've had to face them in Bedford, where I'm originally from. We had a Lib Dem mayor and Lib Dem councillors where I lived. In Cambridge, they were the main force that we opposed in Cambridge politics, and at that time it was a very, very hard fought battle between Labour and the Lib Dems in Cambridge. When I moved to Oxford, the Lib Dems was still a major set of political opponents, although this was after the coalition, so they were on the back foot for sure. But in all of these cases, they had a way of campaigning, which I would say was a very dishonourable form of campaigning, where they would latch onto some kind of issue that would basically they saw profit in indulging in people's cynicism about politics, and they would make themselves a kind of anti-politics party. They would be the party for people's disgruntlement about things not working. And I think from a Labour or a Conservative side, I think I always felt, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I always felt when we faced Conservatives, the Conservatives had a greater sense of what they believed in, and they wanted to win because they wanted to do certain things, whereas the Lib Dems just wanted to win for the sake of wanting to win. I do think there has been a shift in Labour's culture where I think some of that Lib Dem type mindset has set in, and I think you can see that a bit with some of the Labour MPs. I think that's a great tragedy, but that was a clear divide. But that led to a perception in among Labour and Conservative activists and members that the Lib Dems were willing to sell out whatever principles they had, if they had any to begin with, to gain access to power. I loved the quote from David Blunkett, the Labour Home Secretary, one of my political heroes, who described the Lib Dems at the time of the 2010 coalition negotiations as behaving like every harlot has done in history. And I think there is some truth to that. Ed Davey would be a wonderful example. He could be the Scarlet Lady of our politics today, a man who would be happy and was happy to serve in a Conservative government, who, if you are correctly, would be happy to serve in a Labour government as well, or certainly be someone who would prop up a Labour government when at the start of his career he'd propped up a Conservative government. So I think David Blunkett's assessment of the Liberal Democrats still rings true 15 years later.
Well, that would be genuinely history-making if Davey ended up being in two cabinets, one a Conservative-led cabinet and one a Labour-led cabinet in his political career. On that note, we'll wrap up this week's Matters of Interest. Just a quick reminder that you can find the podcast now on YouTube, as well as wherever it is you listen to your podcasts ordinarily, and you can watch Richard and I talk about these things as well as hear us. We'll be back on Sunday with the first part of our new mini-series, looking at the Heath versus Wilson elections. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.